And welcome to Suthichai Live English Podcast. The deadline for tariff talks with President Donald Trump's government is July 9th, which is only 3 days from now. The Thai delegation, led by Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Suthichai just returned from Washington yesterday. He failed to reach an agreement, saying that the American side, headed by USTR, U.S. Trade Representative Jamison Greer, had asked for additional offers from Thailand. Kun Suthichai tries to put up a positive note, saying that the American side praised Thailand for being enthusiastic in the negotiations. Suthichai tried very hard to repeatedly underscore his proposed win-win solution between Thailand and America. But it was obvious that no agreement was reached, and there was no talk about extending the deadline. That means that if President Trump says he is sending out letters to a few, maybe 100 countries, no more negotiations, we are going to charge you this rate of tariff. He said he had in fact signed the first lot of 12 letters to be sent out on Monday. We don't know whether Thailand is still in the negotiation pipeline, or is Thailand on the side or in the group to wait for letters. If the deadline is not extended, that means Thailand will get 36% tariff rate. Compared to Vietnam's deal, which is 20% for all Vietnamese goods going into America and 40% tariff rate for transshipment. While the American side will have free and total access into the Vietnamese market. Thailand does not know where it stands at the moment. If the Vietnam agreement is the benchmark, will Thailand be able to accept it? If not, do we get a 36% tariff flat? And what about transshipment rates? All these questions are up in the air. We'll have to dig into it and see what implications there are for Thailand. Here it is, Ping and Pong, our AI team, trying to explain and analyze where Thailand stands at the moment. Hi, Ping and Pong.
Welcome to Suthichai Live English Podcast. We are Suthichai's AI team. I am Ping.
And I am Pong.
Hello, and welcome to you, our listener, to another deep dive. Today, we're really cutting through the noise. We're looking at a critical, high-stakes situation unfolding right now. There's a deadline coming up that could seriously reshape some economic ties.
Right.
We're zeroing in on these really tense trade negotiations between Thailand and the United States, specifically over potential unilateral tariffs.
Right.
And the clock is truly ticking towards July 9th. If no agreement is reached by then, well, the U.S. has signaled it could impose tariffs. We're talking as high as 60 to 70%.
That's an astronomical figure, just huge.
For any country relying on exports, yeah.
Exactly. And what makes this even tougher for Thailand is that a very recent agreement between the U.S. and Vietnam has essentially set a new benchmark.
A benchmark, okay.
Yeah. The U.S. is clearly using the terms of that Vietnam deal as, their starting point. It's their reference for negotiations with other countries now, and that includes Thailand.
I see.
So our mission today is really to unpack the U.S.-Vietnam deal. We need to understand the specifics, the thinking behind it, and most importantly, what it all means for Thailand right now.
Absolutely. So the central question for this deep dive becomes, what does Vietnam's experience actually tell us about Thailand's chances, their realistic chances of getting a favorable deal, and what are the key factors here?
The crucial factors, yeah. What's going to decide the outcome?
Okay, let's get into this Vietnam deal then. It's the new standard, you say. What exactly did Vietnam agree to? What were the specifics?
Okay, so the deal, announced by President Trump, it had several core parts. First off, Vietnam agreed to accept a 20% import tax on its goods going into the U.S.
20%. That's significant right there.
It is a direct concession.
Was there more to it than just that 20%?
Oh, yes. It got more complex. There was also a higher tax, 40%, specifically applied to what they called transshipment goods.
Transshipment. Okay, remind us what that means exactly.
Sure. So for you listening, transshipment goods are basically items that aren't really made in Vietnam. They just pass through the country.
Like trying to hide the real origin.
Exactly. Often to, avoid tariffs from the actual country of manufacture. So this higher 40% rate was the U.S. trying to clamp down on that, tax evasion, circumvention, that sort of thing.
Got it. Makes sense.
But maybe the biggest piece, the most far-reaching term, was Vietnam agreeing to open its own market to U.S. goods at a 0% tariff rate.
Wow. Okay, hold on. That sounds, well, pretty unbalanced on the surface. Vietnam pays 20, maybe 40%, but lets U.S. stuff in for free.
It does sound that way initially, yes.
So what was the thinking there? What was the strategy behind such a, well, seemingly one-sided agreement? Why did Vietnam accept terms that look, kind of disadvantageous from just a tariff angle?
That is exactly the right question, and the answer really tells you a lot about Vietnam's long-term strategic thinking. You see, Vietnam's economy is just incredibly dependent on access to the U.S. market.
How dependent are we talking?
We're talking huge numbers. Their exports to the U.S. make up something like 30% of their total national exports.
30%?
Yeah. And put another way, that's roughly 25% of their entire GDP.
A quarter of their economy. Okay.
So for Vietnam, keeping that access to the U.S. market wasn't just, important. It was absolutely paramount, almost an existential economic thing.
Right. So the cost of not getting a deal would have been
catastrophic. Simply catastrophic.
So that explains the motivation, the sheer need. Mm-hmm. But how did they manage to pull it off? Was there something else?
There was. Beyond that dependency, a really critical factor was their approach. It was remarkably proactive and unified.
Unified how?
The Vietnamese government and their private sector worked incredibly closely together, like almost seamlessly. They didn't just sit back and react to U.S. demands. They really did their homework.
So they anticipated things.
Exactly. They understood not just the trade stuff, but broader U.S. interests, like investment interests. For instance, they actively talked with big U.S. companies like Boeing. They understood U.S. interests in things like LNG, agricultural products.
So they were looking at the bigger picture. Yeah. Beyond just tariffs.
Precisely. This proactive engagement, plus, frankly, the political will to move decisively, it allowed them to put together a comprehensive package, something that addressed U.S. concerns way beyond just the import taxes.
So it wasn't just about tariffs then. It was about securing long-term investment, too, offering market access for stability.
That's it, exactly. Vietnam saw this as a long-term strategic play, a grand bargain, if you will. Mm-hmm. They likely calculated that, okay, these immediate tariff costs, they seem high, but they'd be far outweighed by the long-term benefits. Things like attracting serious foreign direct investment, FDI, and really stimulating their own domestic economic growth.
So they were playing the long game.
A much longer game, yes. Betting that those future benefits would more than make up for the immediate hits. And that kind of decisive future-focused strategy, well, that's what made the deal possible, even with what looked like pretty steep short-term costs.
Okay, that paints a very clear picture of Vietnam's strategy. So now, the big question. Given Vietnam set this benchmark, what does it all mean for Thailand? What's the immediate impact? The challenge?
Well, the direct pressure on Thailand is immense, really immense. The U.S. is now essentially using Vietnam's deal as the absolute starting point.
Like a baseline.
The baseline, exactly. They're looking for a very similar arrangement. They're likely starting the talks right at that 20% import tax level for Thai goods.
And what's the Thai private sector hoping for? Are they resigned to 20%?
They're understandably hoping for a lower. You hear figures maybe in the range of 15 to 20% being floated as, an acceptable outcome. But even that is now looking like the optimistic end of the scale.
So even if Thailand somehow manages to get that 15-20% rate, are there other problems, other challenges that might affect their competitiveness compared to Vietnam?
Oh, absolutely. There are significant inherent disadvantages for many Thai products. Even if Thailand gets the same tariff rate as Vietnam, let's say 15 or 20%, lots of Thai goods just cost more to make.
Why is that?
Primarily, it comes down to significantly higher electricity costs and a higher minimum wage.
Electricity costs, right. That's a recurring theme.
It really is. Thailand's energy mix is still quite reliant on natural gas, which has seen prices fluctuate. The infrastructure sometimes means higher per unit costs. Vietnam, on the other hand, often benefits from cheaper labor and in some specific industrial areas, better energy rates.
So that hits things like
Labor-intensive goods especially. Think certain agricultural products, textiles, some electronic components. They're less competitive right from the start, even before you add the same tariff. The basic cost of production in Thailand is just higher for many sectors.
That's a critical point. It's not just the tariff wall, it's the cost floor underneath it. Okay, what about the other side of the Vietnam deal? That flexibility they showed, opening their market 0% to the U.S., making decisions quickly. Can Thailand match that?
Well, on the 0% tariff for U.S. agricultural products, it's highly unlikely Thailand can offer that.
Why not?
It's just an incredibly sensitive area domestically in Thailand. You've got a large farming population. They have a significant political voice. Any move to just open the floodgates to zero tariff U.S. farm imports would face, frankly, fierce internal resistance.
From farmer groups, politically.
Yeah, could see that.
Major political repercussions.
What?
It's a real tightrope walk for any Thai government, balancing these international trade demands with protecting domestic livelihoods.
Okay, so that 0% offer is probably off the table for Thailand. What about the speed? Can they make decisions as quickly as Vietnam seemed to?
That's another challenge. Generally speaking, Thailand's government processes decision-making, amending regulations. It tends to be more complex and, well, slower than Vietnam's.
How so? You often have multi-ministerial consultations, sometimes requiring parliamentary approval for big economic deals, extensive public consultation requirements, especially in sensitive sectors. It's designed to be thorough, but it takes time.
Compared to Vietnam's system.
Which tends to be more centralized in its decision-making structure, allowing for quicker, more decisive action when needed. So this inherent structural difference, it could definitely slow Thailand down in these negotiations, especially with such a short deadline.
So slower processes, less flexibility on agriculture.
Yeah.
Are there any advantages for Thailand here?
There is one small but potentially significant advantage. Thailand actually has a pretty positive track record and a transparent approach when it comes to dealing with those transshipment issues we talked about.
The goods just passing through.
Exactly. And the U.S. has actually acknowledged this positively in the past, so that specific part of the negotiation, maybe Thailand has a bit more positive leverage there.
Okay, so we have this huge pressure from the Vietnam deal, cost disadvantages, slower government machinery, but maybe a small plus on transshipment. But that July 9th deadline is looming large. It feels incredibly urgent. What is Team Thailand actually doing right now? And how are businesses coping?
Well, the Thai negotiation team, they are working flat out, around the clock. Putting forward key proposals, though obviously the specifics are being kept very confidential right now.
Understandable.
But the absolute critical point, the thing everyone needs to understand, is that a deal must be reached before July 9th. This is a hard deadline.
No extensions. No more talks after that.
That's the message. If there's no deal, the U.S. will just unilaterally impose the tariffs. No further discussion. They'll simply implement them.
That feels unusually firm for trade talks. Does the U.S. often use such hard deadlines? What does it signal here?
It definitely signals a very firm, very resolute stance. The U.S. is basically saying, look, we have a template now, thanks to the Vietnam deal, and we expect you to meet it or something very close by this date. We have seen similar deadlines used before, yeah, especially where the U.S. feels there's a big trade imbalance or specific unfair practices they want stopped quickly. It shows they're confident in their position, and they're ready to use that leverage, the threat of unilateral tariffs, if they don't get an agreement fast.
So the pressure on the Thai negotiators must be immense.
Unbelievable. Their mandate is clear. They need to be decisive. They need to be flexible where possible, but at the same time, fiercely protect Thailand's core national interests. It's an incredibly difficult balancing act under extreme time pressure.
And what about the businesses, the companies on the ground who will actually have to pay these tariffs if a deal isn't reached, or even if it's reached at that 15-20% level? How are they preparing?
Well, as you can imagine, there's heightened anxiety, a lot of concern. Businesses are deeply worried about immediate cost increases.
Not just from tariffs, right?
No, exactly. It's the potential tariffs plus the strengthening U.S. dollar, which makes imported raw materials and components more expensive too. It's a double hit.
And the uncertainty must be paralyzing.
It makes business planning incredibly difficult. How do you plan your costs, your pricing, your global competitiveness, your investments, when you don't know if this massive tariff wall, potentially 60, 70%, is about to drop?
It's like trying to navigate in a fog.
Exactly. Every decision feels like a gamble. We're hearing about, mid-sized electronics firms already drawing up contingency plans. Some are even looking at partially moving some production, maybe to places like Vietnam, ironically, just to reduce the risk.
Wow. So it's forcing some immediate, maybe drastic actions already.
It is. So their survival strategies right now are heavily focused on what they can control internally.
Like what?
Boosting productivity is key. Looking at automation, lean manufacturing processes, anything to squeeze out efficiencies, and rigorously controlling every internal cost they possibly can.
Which brings it back to
electricity costs. Again, it's just such a major hurdle the government really needs to tackle because it directly hits their ability to compete. Businesses can't easily pass these higher fundamental costs onto global customers, not with the fierce competition out there.
So they're trying to get leaner, meaner. Any other strategies?
Yeah, we're also seeing businesses seriously consider diversifying their export markets, maybe focusing more on regional partners within ASEAN or China, or trying to boost domestic consumption if the U.S. market just becomes too expensive to sell into. It's really an all-hands-on-deck effort to stay afloat, whatever the outcome of these talks.
Okay, so let's try and summarize this deep dive. The pressure on Thailand is immense. July 9th is the hard deadline to get a deal. The hope seems to be for a tariff rate maybe between 15 and 20%. But even then, those underlying cost issues, especially electricity, pose a real challenge to competitiveness.
That's right.
And meanwhile, the Thai private sector is basically bracing for impact, preparing for cost increases no matter what, focusing hard on internal efficiency, controlling costs, and looking desperately for other markets or ways to compete.
That sums it up well. They're trying to manage the immediate crisis while facing these deeper structural issues.
Right.
And, beyond this immediate tariff crisis, this whole situation really raises a bigger, maybe more important question for you, the listener, to think about.
Okay.
What structural adjustments, what long-term strategies does Thailand really need to implement to fundamentally boost its overall economic competitiveness?
Yeah.
How can it potentially outpace key regional rivals like Vietnam in the future, regardless of how this specific tariff issue plays out?
That is a powerful question. Looking beyond just this crisis to the fundamental changes needed for long-term resilience and growth. Something important to reflect on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into what is truly a critical and still evolving situation for Thailand.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for following Suthichai Live English Podcast. We are Suthichai's AI team. I am Ping.